Hello, hello, and welcome. In today's episode, I am here with Sara Chizek, and she is a grief and sensuality coach. After losing her father when she was 4 years old and being largely numb to the pain and loss for so many years, she learned how to alchemize her pain and turn grief into her superpower. Now she empowers women to harness the energy of grief, anger, stuckness, and turn this energy into joy, pleasure, and power to unlock their desires. Sara leads grief embodiment workshops and has an online membership and offers private group coaching. Sara, my fellow goddess, I am so excited to have you here today and welcome in. And I would love to, as we introduce you into this community, would love to hear your story of how, in having that kind of loss that I know a lot of people experience at a young age, and how that process was for you when you become aware of that compounded grief or that grief, and how moving through that really got you to where you are today. So I'd love to hear from you, your story, and please share as much or as little as you'd like.
Oh, thank you for having me on. Honored to be here with you, Goddess Nicole. I was very shut down to the early loss of my dad. He passed away when I was 4, and I was lucky enough that my mom remarried and there was a lovely new father figure in my life. But that being said, my life kind of just got patched up back together, and we all kind of just soldiered on in some ways. And so there was definitely this element of not tending to that pain, not tending to that heartbreak, and going through the motions of life, checking off those boxes, trying to, be accomplished in school, go get the job, etc. So it wasn't until my mid 20s where I started going to therapy, and I realized wow, I can't really even talk about my dad's death without just without even forming a full sentence around it felt difficult. I noticed that there was definitely some numbness there, some shutdown, some resistance. And at that point I had really I was things were coming to a head that I didn't really truly know myself. I didn't truly know my soul, and I was desiring more of that personal spiritual connection. And so it was really through the path of learning about who my dad was, learning about what his interests were, that allowed me to almost be a portal to get to know myself better through the process. And fast forwarding 4 years after that, I came in to this body of work that Nicole and I are both familiar with around Mama Gina's body of work, which is using your emotions as almost deliberately feeling them as a way to harness your power. And so there is this particular practice of swamping, which is one of Mama Gina's tools, that allowed me to truly feel that, wow, there is a portal here. There is this is a path to knowing myself in a deeper way, and to coming into relationship with my sexuality in a way that felt more connected to myself and more connected to who I truly was. And so it was almost that was the straw that broke the camel's back, in the sense that my life kind of already wasn't fitting, my corporate persona wasn't really fitting my soul. And then after I discovered this body of work of really feeling my emotions, it really gave me the permissioning that I needed, my own inner permissioning, to go start my own business and to help other women kind of move through their grief and move through claiming their sexuality in a way that feels empowering and whole, and not, not ignoring the very real parts of grief that are so important to nurture and honor and tend to in the healing process.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's so powerful. And when you first started discovering, when you started therapy and started talking about your dad, where prior to knowing what that all was for you, how did the numbness or that part of that untapped processing of grief, or even maybe having conversations with your mom or your family about your dad, how did that kind of play out in other areas of your life? Or how did that show up for you in your own sense of self and your confidence and your ability to feel fully expressed?
Yeah. I mean, I think that like I was numbing out in many areas of my life. Like I was definitely using alcohol as a means to like disconnect and disassociate from some of the pain that I was feeling. I was even my relationship with like dating and men, it was very like surface level. And I noticed that I was afraid to like go deeper. And I think so many people relate to the idea that like if you let yourself grieve like a little bit, that like your whole life could unravel and like you could never patch your way back together. And so I was definitely sitting with like decades of that fear, and really just noticing like my level of discomfort with sharing my own inner truth. And I remember like sitting at a table with some of my friends as I was starting to find the languaging around my dad's death and just like sharing a little bit, and almost just sitting there in nervousness as to like how they would react, what people would say. And it was like I was testing the waters around my own language.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's important. I noticed when I was like therapist shopping in my early 20s, something that I found really helpful was people were like, when you go in, there is that element of feeling into like, can this person hold the space? Like, can they hold what I'm sharing with them? And the work that you do, well, and that we do, but the work that you do specifically around grief work, there is this element of, I think there's a stigma around, well, I don't think there is, I know there is a stigma around grief, and people tend to not feel like they can share it because they're like, oh, it's too much for other people, or they're going to think differently of me, like I'm not as powerful or as perfect or whatever those things are. And I'd love to hear, because of the women you work with and in your own experience too, how that shows up for women in hiding. Because really it's like this holding and hiding that happens where it's like so heavy and it's just so much, but then feeling like you don't know where to like unpack it.
Yes, absolutely. And when I ask most of my clients, like, what were you taught about expressing your emotions growing up? The common answers are like that we must process things alone by ourselves, like with the door closed, as to not inconvenience others or to not take up too much space or to make sure that we're not making anyone else uncomfortable. Right? Like there's a ton of messaging around us always keeping a smile on our face, or like being the caretaker and like putting your own emotions last, right? Like at some point, you know, certain kids were, you know, physically abused for showing emotion. And so there's like a deep kind of underlying fear around truly showing up as that like unfiltered emotional being, and so much conditioning around that. And so I like to just invite in that prompt of like, what were you taught? And as you're listening to this, like, what were you taught about expressing your emotions? Because so often it leads to like exactly why we need spaces where we can show up as our full selves, and where we are not like placated or like made to just be like, oh, everything's fine, let me pass you a tissue, but like to fully be seen in your heartbreak, to fully be seen in you know, your rage and your sadness. All of these different flavors of grief is so powerful, and it's really rare. So like even if you're new to these spaces, like even like being familiar that something like this exists, I know I had no idea about, you know, 7-8 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's so powerful, because I think especially with the type of women that we work with like coaches and entrepreneurs and leaders basically, and women who are up to big things and have big desires, where there's such that stigma around showing up, I think presenting in a certain way, which causes a lot of women to perform and or just not even know that these tools are available. And I'm curious, in your experience or with some of your clients, what were some of the biggest stigmas to diving into this work, and what, I'm curious your experience on this. Did you find therapy or the like the body-based work to be more powerful? Because I know for me, it's the latter, around the body-based and the moving it through. But I would love to hear some of the reasons of why you've experienced women may be afraid to start this work, or afraid of their own, like you mentioned a little earlier about, like, if I go in, it's like, I'll never come out. But I'd love to hear your experiences around both of those.
Yes, absolutely. I think there's a few things at play. Like, one, it's just awkward and clumsy a little bit. And what I'm speaking to around that is especially the physical embodiment of grief, which is the work that Nicole was just referring to, of like moving it through the body, right? Like, this is how this is the full like temper tantrum expression of grief, allowing yourself to wail and to punch and to kick and to scream and to howl, and like really feeding that piece of you. And like, frankly, that can just be plain awkward when we're first starting out, because we've been trained against this, right? Like, we've been trained to keep it all together, to like stay buttoned up. And that like training has also been like useful to us out in the world to like not draw too much attention to ourselves, or maybe like get the job or the promotion. So like, there's many reasons why that training has come to be, but to step into a space where it's the opposite is true, like the more wild and primal you can be, the better. Feels like just a whole nother world, and it can be super awkward to let the body actually like kick and stomp and scream and punch. And that's just something that over time, with like practicing and allowing and permissioning yourself time and time again, can feel can really shift. But then the other piece of that is, oftentimes this is an iceberg, right? So grief and like all the culmination of like all the like big traumas, little traumas of our lives it really is an iceberg. And so it doesn't thaw out super quickly. And so I think a huge piece of that is just having compassion for the pace of which you move through this process of untangling your grief, of meeting your grief, of coming into relationship with your grief. That it's truly like the companion of that process is compassion in so many ways, of honoring the slowest pieces of you, right? Of going at the pace of the slowest pieces of you, so that you're not bringing in like some of the toxic practices of the patriarchy, which are just like get through it and plow through it, but instead like really allowing the unfolding.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And there's this piece, that compassionate piece, because when you're talking about at first, like, let it be awkward with the stomping and the moving through the body, because it's almost like our head is up here looking down, like, why are you doing that? Like, that's weird. And like, how is this helping? And we need to like do something. And that mind talk that can happen. And I remember experiencing that when I first started doing this work too. I was like, this is fucking weird or whatever, but
totally.
Which I think is a common response to it, because it's different, right? It is weird because it's not normal in the sense of how we're taught. And this piece around, and this is a huge piece in what I teach as well, around this compassionate piece around honoring all of these pieces of ourselves that we've had to split off and set aside and hide and silence in order to survive in a society that, you know, if you're not perfect and professional and put together all the time, then you're not keeping up, you're not, you know, like on track for X, Y, or Z. And it's in the rupture, and we're going to talk about what that is as well, that sometimes those ruptures really allow us to unpack, unfold, unlearn, undo a lot of conditioning and different things, that in order for us to become even more expansive and soul led and all those things. So with that being said, I'd love to hear in your work, how you work with rupture, what rupture is, and how that is a part of cracking into the grief process and what grief work looks like in that regard.
Yes, yes. I mean, I like to think of it that, if we're all walking the path of the goddess doesn't know the difference between lightness and darkness. Like, it's just like it's in its entirety of like the cosmos. And so being able to look at some of our darker emotions, our more difficult to sit with emotions, as initiations into a deeper knowing of ourselves is so powerful. And to frame it in a way of like, how can I be cracked open? Like, how can I be fucked open by this experience of rupture? And I think, like, life is going to throw bumps on the road, right? You're gonna be throwing bumps at the road throughout your journey, and it's like, how do you want to relate to that? I think like, if we think about the concept of expansion and contraction, there's so much out there that like idolizes the expansion of like the growth and like all the beauty and all the like rainbows, butterflies, right? And then it's the contraction that like actually births the baby, right? It's like that super important period of being able to maybe slow down, like like come into a place of like stillness with ourselves and actually birth what that true expansion is. And yeah, go ahead.
Oh no, go ahead. I was just like, yeah. I was taking it in. Sorry if I interrupted you, but please continue.
And so the beauty here of this process is if you find yourself in a state of rupture or in just a state of like where everything feels like it's not working in life, right? Like where your world is falling apart, how can we dignify those very real feelings in that process? How can we dignify the parts of you that are in pain, the inner child pieces that are in pain, and all of the different parts of your system that are hurting? And also initiating you into how do you want to show up in this situation as like with your higher self like crown on, right? It's like holding the both dignifying and like initiating energy of a contraction.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is such a powerful example of what you just spoken to around owning what you can control. It's like we can't control other people, situations, when people pass away, or if we get attacked, or different things that happen. And when we're able to move through that rupture and that break, and not, even if we have a breakdown, to not letting it break us, in the sense of you're learning how to work with the fabric of your life and what things are coming around. And that's so important, rather than avoiding it and trying to just, like you had spoke to with your family, where like we just soldiered on. And that's what so many people do. That was my experience, because I didn't know any different. I didn't know, that was just what I was taught and the environment that I was in. And I feel like this piece shows up a lot around people's businesses as well. Yeah. And I would love for you to speak into the importance of having sacred space for grief work, how that kind of looks like in the work that you do, and how not doing this work and doing this work shows up for women in their business, because it's so important for us as leaders and people that are holding sacred space for other people too.
Yes, absolutely. I think that when you're an entrepreneur, you're holding a business, like you're holding a lot, right? You're holding so many different elements. You're holding your clients, you're holding like the business side of things, you're holding yourself, and then you're also holding the external world of the family, etc., right? And so having a space where you don't have to hold it all together is so important, where you can show up messy, where you can show up and cry, where you can show up and like compost like all of the things that are happening your life into more of like a renewable energy. I know in my own experience of running a business, like it's so easy to get frozen and to get stuck when we fall into a space of contraction, whatever the thing is, um like not meeting a goal, etc. Like it's so easy to be really hard on ourselves and judge ourselves for feeling like a state of contraction because we're supposed to be shiny all the time. We're supposed to show up this way and we're supposed to do this and to do that. And so creating sacred space for yourself to truly feel those disappointments that happen in business, creating a sacred space for you to truly feel any like personal ruptures that are happening alongside your business so that you can have clean energy as you show up in your business with your clients, right? It's like the key of like alchemizing it all and having these spaces to be able to show up with like your CEO hat on in your business or in your business mastermind and show up with your coaching hat on. It's like, I truly believe that having a space to alchemize it is like bread and butter of being able to show up.
Absolutely. And that's what I feel like the work that we do is the missing link to business coaching, because it's like you can have all the systems and structures, but if you don't feel really clean and in your own power to show up to things, and whether that's speaking online or being consistent or just really owning your truth and your message and what you have to say, they don't really, a lot of coaches don't dive in that deep to those things. And it really is so much inner work that isn't just mindset, right? So this is like where we move with the body and help the body feel safe in all of those ways. And I'm curious for those who are avoidant of grief work. I think there's an element, and I'd love to hear your, views on this, around having it be pleasurable. And I'm not saying that grief feels good, because there is a very deep pain that can happen throughout different times in our lives when we experience loss of any kind. But I feel like when you learn this work, there's an element of when you're not resisting it or trying to not feel it, and there's that compassion, like you're speaking, where it actually gives you so much reverence and almost like opulence and beauty to life, where you can see like how much you actually care and how much love there actually is, and in how it opens you up to maybe living and being and seeing the world differently. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on using grief work in that way, where you can tap into your pleasure through it versus having it just be like the excruciating part of grief that your heart feels in that.
That was so beautifully said, Nicole. I loved how you framed that. Yeah, because you're so right. It's like we're not bypassing anything here. Like we're fully feeling our feelings and dignifying those feelings. And like the reframe is that when we can get into agreement with those really hard feelings, then everything is easier. But oftentimes we're like white knuckling it, right? Like we're doing everything we can to not feel our grief. And then we end up oftentimes like disassociating or numbing out in various ways, shapes, and form. Whereas if we like invited our grief along on this journey, right? And like you would building a relationship with like a friend, right? Or even like a new partner, like get to know it and like see it as a companion, right? Like that we get to shift that perspective of like, oh, like it must stay away, to like, oh, well, you get a seat at this table too. Like I have like, there's plenty of seats at this table of like, the throne of like my queen's court, right? Like everyone can pull up a chair. Yeah. And I think the idea of turning on your grief and finding pleasure in grief really like escaped me when I first came into this body of work. And now I realized that it's actually the body that knows how to do that. And it made sense that I didn't understand it, because it's not really it's not really a mental like concept. But when we can play a piece of music that invites in what it's like to not resist your grief, but to allow it to be here fully. And what if it coexisted while you like gently stroked your body, or brought a little bit of pleasure by like running your hands through your scalp, and really like invited in the coexistence of both, like delighting in like the small pleasures of like touching your skin and feeling the full range of your emotions. Then, like you said, like this is how those of us that came here to feel it all and to like get this perspective on life of like this full range of emotional being, which is like the fullest life experience. I believe that it's that opening through like the darkness that can be so powerful in shifting what we're here for, like what we're open to on this lifetime,
Yeah, absolutely. And there's so much power in this work, especially with grief work, where well, I'll share a personal experience. This last year I went through depression, and I didn't know that it was actually kind of, I think, longer than, but when I was down in Mexico, I just felt so heavy, and grief can feel like tar, like you can, it's just like I'm not moving, and it's just heavy, and it's not a fun place to be. And I'd never experienced depression before, and so this piece where people are like, just move on and like push through and just whatever, and it's like, dude, I'm just trying to get out of bed and take a shower, like that was like my experience. And when I was working with a friend of mine who's a trauma therapist, and she called and she was like, Nicole, I just need to tell you something, and I don't know how to say it, but I'm just going to say it. And I was like, please, like I'm open to people being honest. So I was like, please do. And she's like, you're depressed. And I was like, oh, that's what's been the thing. And I was actually relieved, because I was like, I've been like wondering why I feel so horrible all the time. And so it was when I was given, I don't like to say so much the label of that, but like the identification of that. And when I started applying the tools that we use, it was like, I would wake up, and if I wanted to cry, I'd be like, instead of being like, here we go again, I need to do stuff and like try and like move through it, I was just like, okay, well, like bring on, like if you just want to, however long to cry and for whatever, and if there's not even a reason, like it just moved into this place where I started treating myself like I would a kid. Because if a kid was just like sad about something, I wouldn't be like, why are you crying? Like, get over it. And it's like, oh, babe, like, let me hold you and like, tell me about it, kind of a thing. And so I think there's this element, and you were speaking to this earlier too, around the compassion, but really in real time, dropping that resistance, and like, instead of white knuckling, trying not to feel the things, is like, how can you be in container of, support with a coach like you, or in a, group, where it's that teaching of self to just, and it's not like it feels great, but when you stop resisting it, I think that's the piece where that pleasure can come on. And something that I really resonated, and at first was kind of like, what? But then I was like, oh, with Mama Gina, was when she talked about, like, we were saying a little bit to this too, around the turn on around it. And it's like, oh, it's so sexy when I feel like shit, or like turning it into more of a playful, like really changing how we look at it and the judgments of it. And I would love to hear your experience of also too, where that turn on piece comes in, where it's like how changing that conversation into it being more of that welcoming to the banquet table, like, oh, you sexy bitch, you're crying again. Instead of being in that victim, like, why is this happening to me? Why do I feel like this? Or that kind of, where it's just like, all right, you sexy bitch, you're so sexy when you cry, or like whatever, whatever the thing is. I would love to hear your experience of that as well,
Yes.
and your thoughts on all that.
Yeah. Oh, and thank you so much for sharing like your experience of like really seeing yourself like a child. Like, how would I treat a child in this situation? I feel like the compassion that I just like witnessed is so beautiful. So I just want to frame how gorgeous that is. And like,
Thank you.
yeah, like, I think getting right with our grief, like getting in agreement with our grief, is like feeling empowered by it, right? And so that does come with like a little like flirty playfulness around like, I'm so hot when I feel like shit and can't even get my ass into the shower when I wake up, right? And like owning that like all of you is genius, right? All of you is like perfect exactly as you are. And there's just all of the energy that goes into like suppressing that goes into like judging ourselves for how we're feeling, that goes into like being in disagreement for how we are feeling. All of that that takes a lot of energy, right? Like it takes a lot of energy to hold all of that down. And so like if you think about like yourself like holding this backpack of like boulders, right? Like holding all of this energy that's like in disagreement about your hard emotions. Like if you think about taking some of those like boulders out and lightening your load, and instead meeting your hard stuff, right? Like these are hard things to look at, but meeting it with a sense of flirtation is so empowering, and it's a game changer. And again, when I first heard this practice, I was like, this sounds crazy, but it's totally like, let me tell you about how my life has been so fucked up. Like, and it feels really good because we are in ownership of it, right? Like we're not being victimized by anything here. We're like fully taking it and letting it be our truth in a beautiful way.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me tell you how fucked up this is. I love it. And with that being said, I know, obviously there's a bajillion different views, as there are people on this planet, around, when a catalyst or a rupture happens in someone's life. And when I think whether it's fear-based or control-based or whatever the thing is, where when something bad happens and people are like refuse to be like, how could that ever be a good thing that happened to me? Or seeing the other side, so to speak, of, because really anything that happens in life, it's our perception on it, right? That really defines good or bad, or whatever that is. But in someone who maybe is like, I could never see this, whether it's a situation or a person or whatever, as good, or serving them on their path, or it was meant to rupture them into a new path. What would you say to those women listening, or humans in general that will be listening in, on how to use this work to soften the edges, maybe even around that? Because I know for me, I don't believe that you have to like forgive someone in order to move on or to heal. I think there's an element of working within yourself, because I think forgiveness can sometimes make people feel like, oh, well, it lets them off the hook, kind of a thing, in like bigger situations. So coming back to my question, I'm wondering your thoughts on how someone can start to either soften their views on that, or where grief work supports them in reclaiming that loss of power, whether it was like an actual like attack or assault or a victim situation, or a death or something where they felt really wronged or betrayed, where in owning their own grief and how it affected them, and how that affected their life going forward, how grief work can support them in seeing that situation differently and seeing how it either served them or move them into deeper places within themselves, and your thoughts around what that looks like.
Beautiful. Yeah. I mean, I think some of the greatest gifts that we can have from our own inward journeys is getting clarity on something, on developing acceptance towards ourselves, and compassion, like acceptance and compassion. What's really coming forward for me as you're speaking is that every opportunity is an invitation into deeper compassion for ourselves. And so whether or not like that person like fully believes that like this was meant to happen for them, that it could at least be an invitation that like they get to figure out a way to love themselves through this experience, and a way to be really gentle with themselves in a way that like maybe they are never moving at a slow pace like this before, but this rupture, this grief is requiring of them like a deep slowdown, is like begging for a slowdown, is begging for a getting to know oneself in their like dark night of the soul experience, and sitting with yourself in the discomfort of that, while it's can be super painful when you're in it, right? There's always like a wow, I did that. And like I can say that I did that because it would have been easier to not do that, right? It would have been easier to keep soldiering on, easier to like keep my head down. But instead, I am living with this like open heart, right? Like grief is a reflection of how much I've loved. So if you're experiencing like, if you've experienced trauma, like it's the grief is oftentimes like a reflection of how much you love like yourself, and the pain there, right? And so really inviting in that sense of love.
Yeah, absolutely. So powerful. So powerful. And yeah, let me double check. I know we had a couple people popping in. If you're in the comments, you can say hi, whether live or replay. And yeah, if you have questions, pop them in. We'll give a minute for that. And I would love to know what you got going on and how women can work with you, and let us know how they can connect and what offerings you got right now.
Oh, beautiful. Well, my one of my words of the year is intimacy, and the other is devotion. But I am really craving intimate spaces to go deep into this body of work, because I have a full one-on-one client load right now, and I know that grief is really beautifully processed in community and amongst siblings, right? And so I'm bringing together a small group of 3 or 4 people that identify as women to come into this space, and to have it be like a composting container, right? It's like an alchemical landing pad for them to like show up, to cry, to like release, to like get it out, and alchemize and bring pleasure into the process. And so I'm particularly inviting people in that are either holding a lot in their own business or in their career, and are like really needing a space to compost, right? To get to look at their ruptures and their bumps in the road as like portals into their magic that's waiting on the other side for them. And so it'll be a space of like dignifying the really hard feelings, and like moving through and alchemizing to what's on the other side. And so this is the mastermind that I'm offering right now, and it's a really beautiful landing pad. I have 2 spots open, and we are starting in February.
Amazing. I love that composting, because it's that richness of like that alchemy process. And And I believe is it Grieve to Glow? Is that the mastermind name for that?
Yeah, Grieve and Glow, exactly.
Grieve and Glow. I love it. Awesome. Well, I'll have those links available below, and I'll just double check. I think Miss Julianne was on, so hello, darling. And yeah, anyone watching the replay, pop it in there. And Sara, of course, it was such a pleasure, my fellow goddess. And for anyone listening in, we'll have the Grieve to Glow and Sara's contact information, so you can connect with her further after this as well.
Thank you for having me. It's been so wonderful to connect with you, and I appreciate this space.
Of course, it was my pleasure. Thank you.